The first blow landed before she even stepped down from the wagon. Delilah's cheek caught the back of Cyrus Vale's hand, and her thin bonnet did nothing to soften it. Blood gathered at the corner of her mouth as the crowd watched in a hush too loud to bear. "This is what happens," Cyrus barked, "when a bride shows up late." She wasn't late. The driver had lost a wheel. But truth didn't matter in Willow Creek, not when it stood in the way of spectacle. She staggered as he yanked her by the wrist toward the town square, her mail order papers still folded in her skirt pocket, proof of a transaction no one cared to verify. "You all wanted a show," Cyrus growled at the gathering faces. "So here's your precious wife." Then he struck her again, harder this time, her knees buckling on the cold, hard wood of the feed store porch. A child gasped. No one else moved. Her veil fluttered to the ground like a white flag that no one would honor. Somewhere to the left, near the blacksmith's post, stood a man no one remembered arriving. Tall, wrapped in a worn buffalo hide coat, with braids down his back, and a stillness that cut through the noise. He was Lakota, and he didn't blink. The townsfolk called him Ghost Elk, not because of his silence, but because they hoped he wasn't real. Delilah lifted her head through the dizziness and met his gaze. No pity, no shock, just a steady fire in his eyes, as if he were memorizing every bruise. Cyrus grabbed her by the hair, shouting about obedience and decency, and dragged her toward the church steps. "She's gonna learn her place today," he jeered. The preacher did nothing. The women clutched their shawls. Dust blew by. When Cyrus raised his belt, in full view of the town, ready to teach her one good lesson, the Lakota man moved. Just one step forward. No weapon, no word. But it was enough to make Cyrus hesitate, for one breath. Delilah didn't scream. She never had. Not when her father sold her name, not when her mother died alone, not even now. But something shifted in that stillness, something alive. And for the first time, someone saw her pain and didn't turn away. Delilah didn't know what held Cyrus back in that moment, whether it was the hush that fell over the square or the weight of the eyes that didn't flinch. But he lowered the belt and muttered something about her not being worth it. Then he shoved her down the church steps, where she landed hard, scraping both palms. Laughter rose behind her, thin and uneasy, the kind that people used to cover shame. But the Lakota man didn't move, didn't blink. He simply watched until the last echo of cruelty faded. Cyrus barked at her to get inside and prepare his dinner. She did, because what choice did she have? Inside the small cabin behind the saloon, Delilah scrubbed her hands raw, trying to remove the memory of being stared at like a possession. Her lip had swollen, her ribs ached. But that wasn't what haunted her. It was the feeling of being seen, not with pity, but with something older. A kind of knowing. A memory from someone else's bones. That night, Cyrus brought friends to drink. She was told to serve, stay silent, and smile. They made crude jokes. One man said she looked better with a bruise. Another offered Cyrus $3 silver to borrow her for the night. She dropped a cup then, not from nerves but fury. Cyrus struck her again. But this time, the blood tasted different. Bitter, yes, but it didn't choke her. It sharpened her. Across the street, through the open shutter, Ghost Elk stood in the dark, his figure outlined by the moonlight. Watching. Again. She wondered if he would always be there. Silent, unmoving, a witness to the slow unraveling of her spirit. She wondered if he had been sent not to help, but to remember. And then, just as she turned back toward the table, something changed. A feather had been left by the door. Black and white, tucked into the wood grain where only she would see it. Not a gift. A signal. She picked it up with shaking fingers and held it under her apron, close to her chest. For the first time since arriving, she didn't feel alone. The next morning, when Cyrus reached for her, she did not flinch. She stared at him the way the Lakota man had stared at her. And for a second, Cyrus looked uncertain. Delilah didn't sleep that night. She lay awake on the cot beside the stove, the feather tucked in her apron like a question that wouldn't stop asking. She turned it over in her hands again and again, as if it might whisper something if she held it just right. What did it mean? Why had he left it? Was it warning or invitation? Or simply proof that someone had seen her pain and refused to let it vanish into the silence? By morning, she had braided her hair differently. Not to look prettier for Cyrus, but because her scalp had bled where he yanked it yesterday, and she wanted control over one single thing. Cyrus didn't notice. He stormed out after throwing a crust of bread at her, off to argue with the butcher about meat prices. He didn't come back until dusk, drunk, mean, and loud. But Delilah didn't tremble when he burst through the door this time. Instead, she sat quietly, sewing the hem of her apron, as if he weren't even there. And still tucked inside that fold was the feather. He saw it. She saw him see it. And though he didn't ask, his scowl deepened. That night, the townspeople gathered for a harvest bonfire in the field near the schoolhouse. Delilah was told to come and serve cider. Cyrus made her wear a faded yellow dress and told her not to embarrass him. She obeyed, but her eyes scanned the dark edges of the firelight, searching for one pair of still eyes. He wasn't there, at least not where anyone could see, until a group of boys started pushing a young Lakota child near the edge of the flames, mocking his braids and shouting nonsense words in broken Lakota. That's when he appeared. Ghost Elk stepped out of the dark without a sound, lifted the boy gently by the shoulders, and placed him behind his own legs. He didn't say a word, just stared at the boys, not with anger, but disappointment. And somehow that was worse. They ran. Delilah watched it all unfold from across the fire. And then, for the first time, their eyes met. Not across a beating, not across a window, but here, in the center of town. And she nodded, just once, as if to say, "I saw what you did." And maybe he nodded back, or maybe the flames just moved. The fire crackled as the town drank and danced around it, pretending they hadn't seen what just happened. The boys who had mocked the Lakota child were already laughing again near the hay bales, but something had shifted in the air, like the smoke no longer stung just from ash. Delilah moved through the crowd with the heavy tin cider pot in her arms, ladling drinks into wooden cups with the stiffness of someone who knew any wrong move might leave a bruise. Cyrus hadn't touched her all night. He hadn't said much either, but his eyes had followed her like a brand, burning and bitter. And yet, for the first time, she didn't feel alone under that heat. Because Ghost Elk stood just beyond the fire ring, half in shadow, still watching. Not her, but everything. Like a guardian that hadn't decided whether to strike. The boy he had protected sat on a barrel now, legs swinging, a small bird carved from wood in his hands. Ghost Elk must have given it to him. No one else in town had hands that careful. Delilah watched them both between ladles of cider. Watched the man whose silence made men uncomfortable, who didn't raise his voice but somehow changed the shape of a room just by being in it. She didn't know his story. No one did. Some said he had lost his family to settlers. Others claimed he had once been a warrior who chose exile over revenge. She only knew one thing for sure. He saw things others looked away from. And she was one of them. When the music stopped for a moment and the crowd turned toward the pie table, Cyrus found her. He grabbed her arm hard enough to leave finger marks. "Think I didn't see you looking at him?" he hissed, breath thick with whiskey. "Think he'll take you away? You're mine. I paid." She didn't pull away. She didn't cry. She just said, "Then why are you afraid?" That silenced him. Not the words, but the calm with which she said them. She walked back toward the cider pot and kept pouring. Ghost Elk had disappeared again, like always, but she didn't panic. Somehow she knew he hadn't left. And later that night, when she returned to the cabin and unfolded her apron, a second feather was there. This one red. Delilah held the red feather in her hands like it might vanish if she blinked. It was smoother than the first, longer too, and its color, deep crimson at the root fading into rust at the tip, felt deliberate, like a warning or a promise. She didn't know enough of Lakota symbols to be sure, but she knew what blood looked like, and she knew it wasn't her blood Ghost Elk meant. She tucked it into the hollow of the wooden beam above her cot, and stared at it until sleep stole her. The next morning, Cyrus was gone early. Off to the telegraph office, he said. He was angry again, sharper than before. She made the fire slowly, deliberately, taking comfort in the rhythm of simple things. Stirring, folding, breathing. That afternoon, she went to the edge of the woods with the laundry. No one followed her. No one cared where she went as long as she came back by sundown. The air felt different beneath the trees. Quieter. Truer. And there, sitting on a stump beside the creek, as if he'd always been waiting, was Ghost Elk. He didn't move when she approached, didn't speak, just held out a small pouch tied with leather string and placed it on the ground between them. She stepped forward slowly, knelt, and picked it up. Inside were crushed roots, something floral and bitter, and a small carved pendant of a bear's paw. Protection, maybe. Medicine, maybe. A message, definitely. She looked up, unsure what she owed in return. "Why?" she whispered. It was the first word she'd spoken aloud in days. He didn't answer, but his eyes didn't waver. Then, with great care, he pulled a piece of folded cloth from his satchel and opened it. Inside was a ledger page with her name written in ink. Delilah Vale. Paid in full. Beside it, scrawled in another hand, were 3 words. Sold, not kept. She stared at them, mouth parting in disbelief. This was her mail order record. He had taken it. Stolen it, maybe. Or bought it back. Either way, he had done what no one else had. He had removed her price tag. When she looked back at him, her eyes were wet, and her voice broke. "I'm not property?" His stare was answer enough. Not here, not now, not anymore. Delilah returned to town with the pouch hidden deep in her dress, and the ledger scrap pressed flat against her ribs. Every step felt heavier than before, but not from fear. From knowledge. She wasn't free yet, but she'd seen the shape of freedom in that grove, and it looked nothing like the world Cyrus had built. He came home late that night, slammed the door, and barked about the price of sugar like it was her fault. She nodded, cooked stew, cleaned the floor. But he noticed something different in her, some new stillness in the way she held the spoon, like a storm gathering behind her eyes. He didn't like it. "I've half a mind to send you back," he growled, slamming his cup down. "See if the agency'll refund me a cent." She looked him in the eye and said calmly, "They won't. I'm already used." That stopped him cold. Not because of the words, but the tone. Not hurt, not sad. Just done. Later that night, when she stepped outside to dump the water basin, Ghost Elk was there, barely visible in the moonlight, a shadow against the stable wall. He didn't speak. He just lifted a hand and tapped 2 fingers over his heart. She mirrored the motion without thinking. It meant something. Maybe everything. The next morning, Delilah didn't rise early. She let the fire go cold, let Cyrus curse and clatter. Then, just before noon, she stepped out of the cabin with her shawl wrapped tight and walked to the church. The preacher's wife looked up in surprise as she entered, but Delilah didn't stop. She went straight to the front pew, knelt down, and opened her apron to reveal both feathers and the ledger scrap. "I want these buried," she said quietly. "All 3. The woman stared at her like she'd gone mad, but Delilah wasn't speaking for permission. She placed the items gently into the hollow base beneath the altar, a space she'd cleaned weeks earlier and remembered for its emptiness. Then she stood, brushed off her hands, and left. Outside, the townsfolk were gathered near the general store, murmuring about a new lawman arriving soon. Delilah didn't care. As she crossed the road, she looked once toward the trees. Ghost Elk was there, on horseback now, waiting, not to save her, to ride beside her, if she chose. That night, she didn't pack anything. Delilah left the shawl behind, the apron, even the boots that blistered her ankles. She walked barefoot to the edge of town beneath a moon heavy with questions. Cyrus was snoring drunk on the cot. She didn't leave a note. What was there to say? That she was never his? That she was sold, but never bought? That she belonged to herself now, and no man could undo that? She carried only the bear paw pendant, now tied around her neck. At the creek edge, just beyond the cottonwoods, Ghost Elk waited on horseback, 2 woven satchels slung behind his saddle. He didn't smile. He didn't ask. He just reached down one hand. She hesitated for a heartbeat. This wasn't rescue. It wasn't romance. It was risk. It was leaving everything familiar, even if familiar had nearly broken her. Then she took his hand. His grip was firm but patient, the way a man might steady a wild horse who'd never been touched without pain. He lifted her behind him, and they rode, not fast, not fleeing, just forward. Past the ridge where the wind changed. Past the broken wagon wheel still half buried near the town gate. Past everything she used to accept. They didn't speak for miles. It was the silence between them that said everything. The language of people who didn't need to explain pain to be understood. Just before dawn, They reached a rise overlooking a wide valley with smoke curling up from clustered tippies and a river glinting like a sleeping blade. Ghost Elk pointed. "Wakpa Waste," he said softly. "Good river." It was the first word he'd spoken to her. She let the name settle in her mouth like a warm stone. The village below began to stir. Dogs barking softly, a child laughing, the smell of corn and hide and cedar even from here. She swallowed hard. "Will they accept me?" she asked. Ghost Elk didn't answer, but he rode forward, and the people below did not run, did not shout. A woman stepped forward instead, held out a blanket, and without a word, wrapped it around Delilah's shoulders. It was heavy with stories she hadn't yet heard, but ready to carry hers. She was not home. Not yet. But she was no longer a stranger. Delilah learned quickly that nothing in Wakpa Waste was offered out of pity. Every bowl of stew, every stitch of cloth, every place by the fire had to be earned. Not by blood, not by ancestry, but by presence. She didn't speak Lakota, not more than a few words. But hands and eyes were their own kind of language. The women taught her how to soften hides, how to braid hair with purpose, how to grind sage for sleep. Children tugged at her dress without fear. One small girl, Taya, placed a beaded bracelet on Delilah's wrist one afternoon and simply said, "Now it fits." No one asked where she came from. No one needed to. Her bruises spoke louder than stories, and her silence filled the spaces where explanations used to live. Ghost Elk didn't hover. He didn't treat her like something fragile. He came and went, sometimes returning with bundles of wood, sometimes with rabbit or herbs, sometimes with nothing but the scent of wind and distance. But when he returned, he always found her eyes. Always. One night a circle gathered for story sharing beneath the stars. Elders spoke of the time before white rails split the land, of spirits that still walked in deer form, of men who once sang the sky open with their drums. Delilah sat at the edge of the circle, unsure if she was meant to listen. But an old woman beckoned her forward. "You have fire," she said, tapping Delilah's chest. "It just needed air." Then she handed her a coal from the central flame, an honor Delilah didn't understand, not fully. But she held it, trembling, and passed it on. Later, alone by the river, she wept. Not from pain, but because for the first time, her tears felt clean, not shamed, not broken, just real. That night, Ghost Elk sat beside her on the bank, and without touching her, he whispered, "I knew you would stay." She turned to him and said softly, "I didn't think I would want to." "You weren't ready," he replied. "Now you are." And when she looked into his face, lined with both strength and restraint, she realized. This was not a man who rescued her. This was a man who made it safe for her to rescue herself. The piece she had woven like thread around herself began to tremble 2 weeks later when the White Rider arrived. He came alone, dust-covered and tired, wearing a badge half hidden beneath his duster, and a look that didn't belong to a man seeking justice, only a task. He asked no questions at the edge of Wakpa Waste. He didn't need to. The village stilled before him, like animals sensing a coming quake. Delilah had been rinsing herbs by the river when the girl, Taya, ran to her, breathless. "Man come. Wants names." Delilah dried her hands slowly. She didn't run. Not this time. She walked toward the council fire where Ghost Elk stood tall beside 2 elders, and the man with the badge held a folded paper in one hand. He looked at her when she approached, not with cruelty, but exhaustion. "Delilah Vale?" he asked. "Your husband back in Low Ridge filed a missing wife report. Claims you were taken against your will." She met his eyes. "He beat me, in front of the town." The man nodded, unsurprised. "Still his word against yours, and the law out here, it doesn't bend easy." He unfolded the paper. "I've got orders to bring you back." Ghost Elk said nothing, but his stillness became pressure, like air before lightning. Delilah looked at the paper, then at the badge, then at the village she'd come to know not by rules, but by rhythm. "If I go," she asked, "what happens to him?" The officer looked down. "You'll testify. Maybe he serves a year. Maybe not. Town likes its own." She nodded once. "And if I stay?" He hesitated. "Then it'll get messier." Delilah took a long breath. Then she reached into her dress and pulled out the ledger scrap, the one Ghost Elk had given her weeks ago. She handed it over. The man read the words, "Sold, not kept." His jaw twitched. Then he sighed. Ain't right, he muttered. None of this is. But I'm not here to chase ghosts. He folded the paper slowly and tucked it back into his coat. I'll tell them I didn't find you. Then he turned and rode away. No guns, no blood, just a choice honored. And as he disappeared into the horizon, Ghost Elk finally spoke. You gave him truth. Delilah answered. You gave it to me first. The spring rains came early that year, soaking the valley in green and laughter. The ground, once cracked and wary, bloomed with wild onions and wild stories, especially the one about the white woman who knelt beside the fire and didn't flinch when the coals hissed beneath her palms. Delilah was no longer the outsider. She was the one who stitched the cradle boards tighter, who knew which child needed birch tea and which elder liked stories told slowly. She still didn't speak much, but her silence had changed. It no longer held fear. It held place. It held presence. And one morning, before the sun had fully lifted its weight over the valley, she was called to the lodge of the council elder. She entered barefoot, her hair braided with care by the girls who had once only watched her. Inside, Ghost Elk stood near the flames, waiting, not for her hand, but for her name. The elder lifted a handful of sage and let the smoke curl through the air like a ribbon of memory. You came here with no story, she said in Lakota, translated softly by a younger woman beside her. But you walked into one. You stood when you could have bent. You gave water to roots not your own. Then she scattered a handful of dried petals into the fire. You are not called what they once called you. That name was sold. The room fell still. And then, in a voice low but certain, she said the new name. Wiaki Wila, Quiet Flame. Delilah swallowed hard. She hadn't expected to feel anything, but the name entered her like warmth through bone. Not an erasure, but an expansion. Outside, children cheered. Someone pounded a drum once. Ghost Elk stepped forward, offered her not a ring, but a leather bracelet tied with blue beadwork, the color of river ice in sunlight. She took it, tied it herself. That night, under stars she no longer feared, she sat beside him and asked, Why didn't you ever ask me to stay? Ghost Elk looked out across the dark valley. Because you were always free to go. She nodded slowly, eyes glinting like flint in the firelight. Then I'll build my fire here. And she did. With her own hands, with her own name, with no one watching over her, but many watching beside her. Please like, share, and subscribe for more true-hearted tales here on Echoes of the West. If you'd stood beside her as the flames rose and her name was spoken, would you have called her sister too? Tell us in the comments.